Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Kamla Ganesh, formerly from the Department of Sociology, University of Mumbai, and currently Senior Research Fellow of the Indian Council of Social Science Research. In the course Sociology of the Indian Diaspora, we are now going to discuss the colonial period, free migration. The objectives of this module are to familiarize you with the different kinds of migration during the colonial period, indentured labor and free passenger migration, to examine the specific problems of the category of free or passenger Indians, to illustrate these through case studies from South Africa, East Africa, Singapore and Malaysia. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, Indians migrated to various British colonies as indentured and other forms of labor, but also as merchants, agents for shipping companies, clerks, teachers, shop owners and retail sellers. The majority, as is well known, went as indentured labor to sugar plantations in South Africa, Mauritius, Suriname, British Guyana and Trinidad. Others went to labor in tea estates in Sri Lanka and rubber plantations in Malaysia under the Kangani and Maistri systems, which had some similarities to indenture. But there were many other kinds of migrants who were not on labor contracts. Servants and traders were habitual travelers. One ayah, it is reported, travelled 50 times to Britain. Lashkars played a vital role in the maritime trade to and from India. Sepoys were often caught up in the vacillating fortunes and internecine struggles of rival empire builders. There were a large number of teachers, shopkeepers, retailers, hawkers, merchants, interpreters and labourers who went at their own expense. It is important to mention here that indentured labourers were recruited by the British agents, and in free migration or passenger migration as it is also called, Indians went on their own, paying for their own passage, but they went a little later than indentured labour. Let us now look at the categorization of Indian migrants in the colonial period. There are three terms in use: passenger Indians, free or wage labor and indentured labor. Of these, free or wage labor falls within the category of passenger Indians. It is a subcategory. The major point of difference to distinguish between the two, indentured and passenger or free emigration, is that indentured labor was recruited by the British rulers or agents on behalf of the colonial power. The free or passenger migrants went at their own expense, and the colonial rulers did not have to take care of them or be responsible for them. Within that, there were those who went as labor and those who went in as traders or businessmen. Many British documents call the labor as free Indians because some of them had finished their indentured periods and came back as free labor. Other documents refer to them as passenger Indians. So there is some confusion about the nomenclature, whether passenger Indians and free Indians refer to one and the same group, or whether there is a difference. Passenger Indians referring to traders and those in services. Free Indians referring to labor who paid for their own passage and therefore were not indentured. Indentured labor has been covered extensively in writing, but as Bhana and Brain comment, the world of passenger Indians was hardly documented and written about. They were not only traders, businessmen or other occupational communities like clerks and agents. Uma Hupelia Mistry writes to show that there were a large number of passenger Indians who worked as free or wage labor. They were not only from North and South India but also from Punjab and other places. The primary objective of this module is to throw light on this lesser known aspect of colonial migration from India and to track what are the different occupations and profiles of the migrants of this category. The term passenger Indians was not widely used in earlier writings in South Africa. As Mestri writes, it was Mahatma Gandhi who mentioned the two categories of Indians in South Africa, indentured labor and free Indians, which included their free servants, clerks, etc. He further says that free servants came to serve Muslim traders. Gandhi clearly mentions that traders and servants who were serving the Indian traders and indentured whose contract has expired and were absolutely free were all part of this group. But there are scholars who use different terms to denote these new forms of migrants. They employ the word free Indians. Mabel Palmer writes about the free emigrants, Muslim and Hindu traders, and argues that they be distinguished from other classes of free Indians. Those who had served their period of indenture were commonly called passenger Indians. So in a nutshell, one can say that there were three categories of Indians who were living in these countries: indentured Indians who were still in contract, ex-indentured who had finished or served their indentured periods, and those who came from India especially for economic reasons, paying for their own travel. But these were not hard and fast categories. There was a great deal of overlap and goings and comings between the categories. According to Marina Carter, despite the British tendency to categorize Indians in social and occupational groups, in practice there was a great deal of overlap. Many male and female servants ended up as indentured labourers, some of whom went on to further migrate as free or trade migrants, while Laskars occasionally found themselves enslaved or forced to take on work as servants. Similarly, sepoys often had a peasant or servant background, and once discharged could also become an indentured or free migrant. Majority of the passenger Indians to South Africa were Muslim. Bardlow says that Indians in Cape Colony were exclusively passenger Indians in origin, and that, lacking skill of other kinds, they almost without exception became traders and shopkeepers. Muslims tended to become wholesale and retail general dealers and butchers, while Hindus became fruit and vegetable hawkers and shoemakers or leather workers. The term passenger Indian got associated with traders and rich merchants, especially in South Africa. But some scholars like Padayachi and Morel discern two categories: wealthy merchants versus small traders and hawkers. But there were also sundry others. Joy Brain compiles a list of Christian passengers to Natal, which included traders, teachers, interpreters, catechists, etc. Some scholars opine that passenger Indians were all male, while Bhana and Brain as well as Dhupelia Mestri suggest that passenger Indians included females too. Mestri also mentions groups like small shopkeepers, hawkers, shop assistants, accountants, priests, women and children. Marina Carter, while writing on free migration in the Encyclopedia of Indian Diaspora, gives importance to the migration of sepoys and Laskars. They were part of Anglo-French warfare in 1789 and played an important role in 1795 in Moluccas and in Egypt in 1800, and they also served at Macau. Carter mentions that soon after all this conquest, they were mobilized to conquer Mauritius in 1810 and participated in the expedition of Java in 1811. Many sepoys became permanent overseas migrants because of the nature of work and migration. Recruitment for sepoys was not only for outside India mission but within the country too. Saran district in Bihar was known for sepoys recruitment during Robert Clive's tenure in India. By the mid-19th century, around 10,000 Saran people had become sepoys. Even in South India, members of Pallan and Parayan castes joined as sepoys and later migrated as indentured labourers. Most of those who enlisted for indentured migration were sepoys. It shows that the sepoys were the first choice because they were already working and had been tested. In Mauritius, many ex-sepoys were found as plantation worker recruits. By the 19th century, sepoys could be found anywhere wherever Indian migration took place. Some went as indentured labour to avoid the repercussion of the 1857 mutiny in India. After 1857, most of the sepoys were recruited from Punjab. Many did not return to India even after their term ended. They were further sent from one place to another. In later phases, Laskars arrived in Australia as convicts. Today, many Muslim communities around Indian Ocean have roots in Laskar seafaring traditions. The story of the free passenger Indian migration to South Africa is different from that in the other colonial destinations like Mauritius, Trinidad and Guyana. Indians in South Africa were granted free passage back after finishing the indenture period, but also the option to stay back in South Africa. Majority stayed back. Some went back to India and came back again. The second travel of these ex-indentured was at their own expense. Free or passenger Indians had more freedom of mobility and occupation compared to the indentured Indians. In a later section, we will see how the South African colonial government pushed through many laws to control Indian passenger or free migration to South Africa. Let us now discuss a few case studies of select destinations. We begin with Southeast Asia. Indian migrants were present in many parts of the world even before the century of European colonialism began. In some cases, even in the 16th century. But more permanently, they started living and establishing business and other professions in Southeast Asia in the 19th century. It is estimated that non-labor migrants to Malaya were 6,43,000 between 1844 and 1931. Burma and other places witnessed the same type of influx of migrants. Later decades saw a dramatic change in the type and nature of migration. Now people started coming in large numbers, and they not only settled in port areas but also in the hinterland of particular places. New migrants, unlike indentured labor, were free to choose their destinations and could enjoy more freedom compared to the earlier migrants. Majority of migrants to Southeast Asia were from South India, the majority from Kerala and Tamil Nadu, especially the Nattukotte Chettiars from Ramnad district's Pudukkottai region. They migrated to Malaya, Burma, Siam, Java, Indochina and northern Sumatra. Chulias migrated from Kerala. Muslim migrant communities were the Dawoodi Bohras. They migrated from Surat to Bangkok in the 1850s. Khojas migrated from Kutch to Strait settlements in the 19th century. Late arrivals were the Sindhis, who migrated to Singapore, and then the Dutch East Indies, and then Penang and Manila. Indian migration to Singapore is of some antiquity. Before it became modern-day Singapore, the country was part of Malaya for a while. Prior to that, it was known as Singapore. India's contact with Malaya goes back to the pre-Christian era. Some aspects of Indian settlement in Singapore between 1819 to 1969 included regular contact with India and exchange through intermarriages and cultural exchange. This led to a large number of Indians settling in Singapore. Almost every aspect of life in Singapore bears some stamp of Indian culture. During the British colonial period, the majority of migrants were labourers, but other groups included clerks, teachers, small entrepreneurs, merchants and tradesmen. Labour immigration was stopped before World War II, and it further decreased after the post-war period. Indian connection with Singapore goes back to its day of foundation by Raffles in 1819. Raffles' entourage included 120 sepoys and laskars. 2 years later, there were already 132 Indians in a total population of 4,727. By 1871, the Indian population in Singapore reached to 11,501. For a very long time, Singapore became the penal center for Indian convicts. After the Anglo-Dutch Treaty of 1824, Indian convicts were transferred from Bencoolen to Singapore. The first batch of these convicts arrived in Singapore in 1825. By 1860, there were some 2,275 Indian convicts in Singapore. According to rules, every year 10% prisoners were released. A few remained in Singapore and some went to India. Those who remained back married locals, and this added to the mixed population of Singapore. Indians, while they were in jail, were taught many skills. They were engaged in various tasks as agricultural laborers, snake and tiger killers, firemen, drain and road makers, nurses, signalmen, masons and printers. They contributed in the construction of the Singapore state. Indian Singaporeans, though they were contributing to the economy of Singapore, were the target of the local British, who resented the use of Singapore as a dumping ground for convicts. Finally, the colonial government had to close down the jails in Singapore. All the remaining convicts were shifted to the Andaman Islands by 1873. Indian migration to Singapore had virtually ceased by 1950. Singapore got separated from Malaysia in 1965. After separation, it created more stringent controls over immigration. Singapore has all the ethnic and religious groups from India, but the majority are from South India, and they form 80% of the Indian population in Singapore. Among the South Indians, Tamils form the largest number. As far as North India is concerned, Punjabis are the largest groups. South Indians include Chettiars and Tamil Muslim traders, financiers, shopkeepers and boatmen. The next largest group includes Sindhis, Gujarati and Sikh cloth merchants, Gujarati and Muslim textile and jewellery merchants. Indians contributed to every aspect of Singapore life. They had a presence in all aspects of the economy, whether it was textiles, piece goods, wholesale and retail trade, money lending and labour. Indian investment in Singapore was mainly in wholesale, retail, small-scale enterprises. Wholesale textile sales was mainly controlled by Asians. In the money lending sector, Indians were present from a very long time and in large numbers since 1947. Chettiars were the most prominent money lenders in Singapore. Their clients were not just Indian traders and contractors, but European plantation owners and Chinese miners and businessmen and Malay civil servants also. Many things have changed over time between Singapore and India. Only an emotional bond remains at a certain level for Indian origin people with India. while most have become Singaporean citizens. Taking up additional details on the Indian migration to South Africa, it is noteworthy that majority of the indentured labour belong to South India and North India, while free passengers came from Gujarat and to a lesser extent from Punjab. They were mostly from labour, merchant and trading backgrounds. Free servants were the Hindu accountants. They came to serve Muslim traders and businessmen. The colonial government in Africa was against the increased use of Indian labour. Employers were asked to abide by the imperial laws, which said that blacks should be selected as labour and whites as skilled labour. Transvaal was populated mainly by Indians, most of whom preferred the city of Kimberley. Later, Indians settled in cities like Port Elizabeth and Cape Town. Indians in Cape Town came primarily from Bombay Presidency, from the districts of Surat and Bharuch and the districts of Colaba and Ratnagiri. Others were from Punjab, Bengal and Madras presidencies. Principal languages were Gujarati, Urdu, Konkani, Marathi, Hindi and Tamil. Majority Indian migrants were poor farmers. Many took to hawking. In 1902, the colonial imperial government came out with the Emigration Act to restrict Indian migration to the colony. It prohibited any persons who could not write out an application or sing in English and who could not provide some evidence of financial means to support themselves. Males and females who were prostitutes were also prohibited. This new law did not apply to those who were already domiciled in South Africa. There was a section of returnees to India who wished to go back to the colony after the visit. They were given passes to return. This document was the most important ticket to return. It was like today's visa. Returnees had to return within the given time. If they exceeded it, they would not be allowed to enter. Many Indians lost their passes and were not allowed to enter South Africa. Taking up the case of Indian migration to East Africa, the main destinations were Uganda, Kenya, Zanzibar and Tanzania. In the early phase, many went to work for the Ugandan railways as indentured labour, while the later migration that took place was of merchants, businessmen and traders. The famous Mehta and Madhwani families are known as East Africa's Indian merchant princes. Gijsbert Unk talks about the Gujarati business community in East Africa, who were well known for their hard work, long hours of labour and far-sighted business vision. They were famous for their entrepreneurial successes too. Further, Indians outnumbered local businessmen because of their credit facilities as well as the family support. It is widely accepted that Indians came to Zanzibar as traders with no money or very little money with them. But with their hard work, they earned money and made a big name in the business community. Indian businessmen lent money to locals and even to Arab traders and the owners of clove plantations. They also supported the import-export business with Chinese. They served as middlemen between American and German traders in East Africa. Indian businesses failed in the initial stage. After this, many went back to India, while some remained there and started to work in shops. Very little is known about migrants who didn't succeed in business. Destinations like Kenya, Uganda were known to Indian migrants a little later, but Zanzibar, Malindi, Mombasa, Bagamoyo and Kilwa Port were known to Indian and Arab traders for a long time. Dhows were the common mode of transport in those days. They used to ply between November to March from the Indian coast to the African coast and from April to October in the reverse direction. Business in spices, ivory, cotton textiles, profitable but dangerous. Many did not return home safely. Trading business got further strengthened when Arab ruler Sayyid Said moved his capital from Oman to Zanzibar in 1832. He appointed an Indian, Jairam Shivaji, as collector of customs. Many fellow Indian traders flourished during his tenure. Establishment of British consulate in Zanzibar strengthened these ties further. British wanted security as well as mediators to deal with Arab aristocracy. Majority of traders in East Africa were Muslims, while a small number were Hindus too. Majority of the Orthodox Hindus thought that migrating to Africa by crossing the ocean, known as Kalapani, would compromise their ritual purity. If we see the migration cycle, mostly lower caste people migrated as indentured labour, not entirely so. Most of the traders were Muslim, Khojas and Itnasharis. They settled with family in East Africa while Hindus did not. The golden period for Indian merchants was their sojourn in Zanzibar. Unk points out that almost the entire trade in Zanzibar was in the hands of Indian traders, especially Khojas, Boras and Baniyas. The majority migrated for better earnings and livelihood. The conditions of living were not very good, both in India and South Africa. but hoping for better times to come, they stayed there for a very long time. In conclusion, when Indians migrated in the colonial period as indentured labor, they did so because of very harsh and difficult conditions back home in India. The conditions of their passage and conditions of work in the colonies was also harsh and grueling. They were faced with many travails and many difficulties. They were not paid enough. The conditions of work were difficult. They had to face abuses. All this left an impact on their psyche and on their relationship with their relatives in India. In comparison, the free or passenger migrants were in a better off situation. They migrated not so much because of the difficulties back home, but to explore new opportunities in new lands. When they reached, they were welcomed in a better way than were the indentured laborers. They had less restrictions on their movement. They could travel. They could also give vent to their entrepreneurial inclinations. They generally enjoyed their stay. The whole variety of occupations and services and jobs and businesses and trades that free or passenger Indians were engaged in has still not been explored. Their contribution to the economy as middlemen, as businessmen, was quite high. This earned for them a lot of respect. At the same time, there was some resentment from the locals that Indians had cornered a vital space in their economy. But overall, their contribution to the economy has been noticed. But the story of their journeys, the variety of occupations that they practiced, and their contribution to the economy has still not been detailed by scholars to the extent that it deserves.